I don't really process the world through happy or not. I'm talking about this, but here's a view you haven't seen before. Strategy works that way as well.
The great gift you have is being able to create perspective for people.
One of the tools that we use with people is to teach them to think in questions rather than statements. Because usually when you approach a problem, you go, we need to build a bridge. But if you say, how could we get across the river? Well, it could be a bridge, it could be a ferry, it could be a flying fox, it could be a tunnel.
Welcome back to the CEO Advantage podcast. I'm very excited to have with me a long-term friend of mine, a great friend of mine, Dan Gregory. Dan is the co-founder of the Behaviour Report, but is also one of the cleverest, most insightful and funniest guys I know. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you. Good to be here, Paul.
Rather than go through your bio, I'd like you to go through your bio for listeners for our podcast. Tell us, what is it that you do?
Well, apart from being entirely self-approving and a self-promoter, what we do at the Behaviour Report now is we help people develop strategies for success based on understanding human beings better. So we help people understand both themselves and the people they work with, their customers and communities. So it's kind of, I guess, I had a conversation once with Adam Spencer and Adam said, in a world full of maths geniuses, I'm as dumb as a bag full of hammers, but in a room full of ordinary people, I'm a maths genius. And I think in a similar way, I do the same for behavioural sciences. So, I studied behavioural science, but what I'm better at doing is transforming behavioural science into pop culture.
We'll get into that because I think in a previous podcast we had Christopher Foster McBride from Digital Human Assistance, and he was talking about we're entering the age of AI and how fascinating you and your career and the way you think about the humanity and the humans in whether or not it's the age of AI.
Yeah.
But we'll unpack that. Before we get into all of that sort of thing, every guest that I have, I ask the same question to start off with, and that is, what was the first job you got paid for?
First job I got paid for would have been a labouring job. So I did a lot of labouring jobs very early on as a teenager, and some of that was organised through my dad. So my dad worked in a factory. He was a production engineer. And my earliest memory is going in and doing heavy labouring work. I'm one of those people that has a white collar brain and a blue collar body. So that was kind of the first lot of work, and some of it was terrible work. Like I remember working in a chicken factory, and I sort of I was in university by this stage, and they actually asked what work you were willing to do, and you had to tick what you were willing to do, and there was a special category for would you be willing to work in a chicken factory. So that was considered the high bar of you'll do anything for money. So I did that, and I remember the first half of the day I was literally in an ice room. So I'm about 6'2". It was about a 6-foot room, and I was standing on 3 foot of ice, shoveling ice into a conveyor belt, bent over for half the day. So very humble beginnings.
So let's explore that. You've been self-employed for most of your career now.
Life, yeah.
Tell us how that career and really successful career of self-employment, but also self-development and really sharing a lot of what you've learned, you've shared with your audiences, but also they've shared with you, and you've sort of created this virtuous cycle of learning from it. But tell me, where did that start? Did you plan that as your career? Did you know you were going to be self-employed and so visible and listened to?
No, not initially.
Did you want to be?
I think I did. Like I was definitely ambitious,
yeah.
and I was definitely opinionated as a kid.
Yeah.
And I definitely asked a lot of questions. But I was really academic. So I did very well at school, pretty much in every subject. I was lucky. Dad was an engineer who started out as an electrician. So he was really good at maths and drawing. Mum was a child prodigy who won the Nationalist Edford when she was about 11 or 12, and then worked as a music teacher and an English teacher. So we had a really Renaissance upbringing. So my brother, sister and I, we all draw, we all play multiple musical instruments. We all did really well at maths and science and English and art and the whole spectrum of subjects. And one of the challenges with that is like if you're good at woodwork, carpentry is a really obvious career for you. But if you're good at everything, there are no obvious careers. So that was really frustrating. And I was very ambitious and wanted to be successful and, wanted to be the first person in my family to make some real money. But I didn't have any reference point for what that looked like. I didn't have anyone to talk to. I was speaking with a friend of mine who went to one of the best private schools in Sydney, and he said when he was in year 11, the principal got all of the year 11 boys into the hall, and in the hall around the walls were old boys, and the principal said, "There's a leader of every industry in the country in this room. Decide what you want to do and go and have a conversation." Now, I had a great network if I wanted a car stolen or burned out, or if I wanted to work with my hands, but nothing business-wise. So I didn't really have a reference point for it. But I did have a sense that I wanted to work for myself at some point. And so I finished high school at the end of the 1980s when greed was good and everyone got an economics degree. So that's kind of what I started. And very quickly realised it wasn't the right path for me. And at the time I ended up dropping out and then working for a year to save up some money while I made a decision about what I actually wanted to do. And at the time I was doing, Dad had always encouraged the drawing side of things. And I was, one of the ways you as a defense against being the smart kid and the fat kid, you become funny. And I think any kind of, there's a reason humour comes out of bullying, because it's a defence mechanism. You're the only black kid at an all-white school, or the only Jewish kid at an all-Protestant school, or whatever, or the only kid with glasses, or the only fat kid. And I think I humour was something that I developed, and I was actually a really good drawer. So I actually thought what I'd do is become an editorial cartoonist.
How old were you when you decided that?
I was probably 18 or 19. So it was the first year out of high school. And so I went and I studied what was a communications degree, but it had a base in psychology, sociology and philosophy, which were things that I'd never considered. And that's kind of what really sparked the interest in me. And I never really had a passion for clinical work, but I was very much interested in human behaviour, sort of beliefs, belonging and behaviours, why we did the things we did. And at the time, sort of AIDS had just sort of hit by about when I was about 16. I mean, it was hard enough to be a 16-year-old boy as it was, but AIDS pretty much put the kibosh on any plans you had.
And that horrific ad, the Grim Reaper ad.
Well, that's the thing that got me interested in advertising. And Simon Reynolds, who ended up being one of my business partner and my first creative directors, wrote that ad. And so while I was at university, I called Simon every day for 6 months because I had no network for that world. And I finally got in to see him, and he gave me a copy of Think and Grow Rich, Napoleon Hill's book, and said, read that 10 times. And so I read that, and that was sort of an opening to, interestingly, at the time, if you went to a bookstore in the western suburbs of Sydney, those books that wasn't a section. There wasn't a self-help section. There wasn't a business section. There was fiction and non-fiction, but that genre hadn't really taken off. And there was, I think Tony Robbins had written Awaken the Giant Within, but it was a very small.
But Think and Grow Rich was, I can remember that as well at that time in the late 80s. Think and Grow Rich was the book you went to or got pointed at.
And then Stephen Covey's 7 Habits
Yep.
was sort of the other.
I thought that came a bit later for me.
It did come out a bit later.
Yeah.
It did, for sure. So I kind of found this literature and I went, oh my God, this is, the kind of stuff I've been craving that no one was able to give me. And advertising sort of gave me a way of not just being funny, but being thoughtful and actually exploring human behaviour and what makes us do the things we do. And so that was really my intro to that world and how I kind of found my way in.
And did kids from Western Sydney go into advertising in those days?
No.
Yeah.
No, and in fact, I did Award School, which is the national school run by the Australian Writers and Art Directors, which is what Award stands for. And if you want to work in the creative side of advertising, you do Award.
Yeah.
And so it's competitive to get in. I think the year I did it, they got a few hundred applications. They only took 50. And then I did Award School. I graduated in the top 10. Which got me into Award School Masterclass, which was run by George Betsis, who was my business partner Kieran's and my first business partner and creative director. And then I topped Award School Masterclass and George was looking to start his own agency and sort of poached me out of that class. But at the time I did Award School, I was working for Telstra, taking complaints for Telstra. And this is pre-mobile phones or very early mobile phones. So we all had phone numbers with prefixes that were, geographically based. So I had a look through the prefixes of all the phones of all the students in Award School, and I was the only prefix that was west of Glebe in the inner city, right? So there weren't a lot of. It was a very in a Sydney context, eastern suburbs, lower North Shore kind of business.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that upbringing, both geographically, but also from being a high performer and affected the way you went about your work relative to your peers?
Oh, for sure.
Were you as aware of being intelligent and high performing as a young fella as you perhaps are now on reflection?
Yes, I was. And even as a child. And again, it's one of the funny things about growing up in Australia is if you're good at sport, you're a hero. If you're smart, you're up yourself and you have to leave the country to get recognition. And so I think one of the reasons humour develops as a defence mechanism is you need to hide the fact that you're smart. Particularly, in a working class public school environment. No one likes the smart kid. And in fact, we ridicule, we have, words that we use to almost demonize people who are smart. So you kind of have to hide it. And there's also, I was the first in my family to go to university. I had a cousin say, "Oh, so you're better than us now, are you?"
Yeah.
And in my head, I'm like, I've always been better than you. I just now have written proof.
Yeah.
And so there's this kind of, and that kind of defensiveness. Now it sounds like I was being rude to my cousin, which I was. However, there's also, you need to have that kind of defensiveness because there is this kind of cultural thing of the tall poppy syndrome where that somehow doesn't apply to sport. If you're an elite sports person, we love you. If you're an elite thinker or an elite entertainer or an elite person in business, we're suspicious of you and we don't like you. And it's a really interesting thing. So I was really conscious of never feeling like I fit in. Like I didn't fit in. I didn't like sport. I didn't, for me, the outdoors were invented for kids that weren't good at school. And so I never really felt like I fit in culturally into my country, into the part of Sydney I was raised in. And even professionally, I felt like an outsider as well. And in fact, I remember sitting in a board meeting with some really senior people from Coca-Cola when I was working on the Coke business. And one of my clients said to me, Dan, you're from the western suburbs. What do your people think? And I'm
Wow.
like, Jesus, get on a train. I mean, it was, but again, even the world of marketing and business is very, I use Glebe as a reference point because it's kind of the the western part of Sydney that's still inner city.
Yeah.
And, that's kind of where business is. You kind of, if you're west of Glebe, you're a tradie or you work with your hands. Is kind of what it was traditionally.
Yeah. So you poached into an agency, start your career proper, say, in advertising in an agency.
Yeah.
Poached.
Well, the agency was essentially George and I. It was a two-person startup.
There you go.
Yeah. And Kieran Flanagan, my business partner, topped Award School Masterclass the following year.
Wow.
And so she was poached in. So, George was essentially teaching Award School Masterclass for free as a way of poaching the top students out of Award School every year.
Yeah.
And we ended up doing that for 4 or 5 years.
Right. So you do that for 4 or 5 years. You've got some pretty big clients. You're 3 pretty smart people in this business. What happens next?
Well, it's funny. It was one of those things. I often think one of the things that I've done really poorly in my career is I've gained success too quickly.
Yeah.
Not that I didn't earn it, but it was if success comes easily, it's easy to become disenchanted and to lose interest. So within the first 6 months of working in advertising, I got 2 campaigns out the door. Both of them were in the award annual, which is the top annual for Australasia advertising in that year, and one of them won the top award in that year. So I was 6 months into the industry and I'd won the top award for creativity, which was great and a huge cause for celebration. But I actually think it was demotivating in some ways. The other thing that was interesting about that agency is we really started with a core of between 5 to 10 people, once we were really going. And it was very experimental. One of the reasons George hired us is he didn't want to hire people with bad habits. So he didn't hire people who knew what they were doing. He sort of got smart people and said, okay, well, I need you to produce a poster, go figure it out. Figure out how to find a photographer, figure out how to find a typographer, figure out, And so that built a lot of self-reliance into us as well. The other thing that we did was we shared all of our goals very publicly, our professional goals and our personal goals. And it was very much a culture that encouraged front stabbing. So we we had meetings every Monday morning where we cleaned stuff up and we did a lot of things that would probably be illegal under HR standards today. We would review each other's salary every year and we would suggest a plus or minus of 10% based on performance of each other.
Wow.
So we kind of knew what the books were. And the advantage of it is you probably get, I think in a startup, where you're working in every part of the business, you probably get 20 years experience in 5 years.
Yep.
And you really learn the entirety of the industry. So usually if you work, and I've had this conversation with other really senior creative people who go, I had no idea how to run the business. I knew how to be a creative, but we never got to talk to the clients. Whereas Kieran and I were pitching to the clients. We were having the conversation about the budget. We were talking to the production people. We were talking to the media people. We were, developing both strategy and creative. And I think one of the things that, I said that, mum and dad really encouraged a Renaissance mind. And I think that's one of the things that Kieran and I have in common is for both of us, both of our schools had to change the timetable for our school because no one had ever studied the combination of subjects that Kieran and I studied in high school. So I studied 4-unit maths and 3-unit English and science and art and music. And, I did more units than were required. And usually it's like, if you do maths and science, you don't do high levels of
You're
English
a
and
maths
art.
boy or an English boy.
And so we petition people's intelligence off very early, and Kira and I have a particular opinion on that and why that's fraught. And it's certainly not the way we work. So we ended up with this really amazing career that gave us so much exposure to the whole gamut of business. And we were doing business strategy, we were doing new product development, we were doing marketing strategy and planning. We were doing commercial engagement. We would travel around and say, "Oh, we've got this new campaign coming up." We'd have to engage, the national staff, and so it was it was a baptism of fire and kind of learning as we went. But it was also very, very broad and unlike most people who go very deep but narrow, we got a very broad education. And I think that was perfect for what we do now, and it's perfect. I think it's actually really good if for anyone in a leadership position, because you don't just get to know narrow. If you're the CEO of a big company, or even in the military, if you're running a bunch of different departments or in government, you actually need to have a breadth of knowledge, not just the depth.
Can we explore for a moment before we move on to your current successful career? Can we just stay in that space of success at a young age? I watched an interview last night with Steve Perry, who was the lead singer of Journey.
Great voice.
Incredible voice. And one of the great songs of all time, who in 1987 decided, I don't want to sing anymore. At the peak of amazing, but he didn't want to sing anymore because he had success early, and that success was such a buzz that he found that he had to go to more and more extreme lengths to get the buzz that he got early. Yeah. So, and you see that with very successful young athletes, for example, who get adulation from adults and huge amounts of money, and then when their playing career is over, it's like
at 30,
with almost no education, some money, but they don't know how to diet differently, live like a human, like everybody else. And I remember a similar thing for me living in Western Sydney and having moved there and having a successful water filtration business. I was selling water filters when the water crisis broke out.
Right.
So
we're in the middle of another one in Sydney at the moment. So go back in.
Oh, there you go. Well, and I remember at the time I bought myself a Corvette, and it belonged to Peter Ritchie, who was the founder of McDonald's and investor in my business and a great friend and mentor of mine and whatever. And I can remember driving along Parramatta Road and getting to some shops and looking in the glass to see how cool I was. And I looked over and saw this little dorky guy with glasses. I was like, "You wanker." And I couldn't believe the picture I had in my head of how successful I was.
Yeah.
And looking in the window going, "Oh my goodness, that is not what I see in my head in this image." And for me at that time, if you speak to my dear wife, who says hi, by the way, she said at that time you genuinely were a wanker.
Yeah.
But it was the era of greed is good. You needed to be successful.
Do you know what? I actually think it's an asset. I actually think, being a bit of a wanker is probably a good thing. Like, I think it drives ambition.
Yep.
And I know that sounds a really contrary thing to say.
No, but it did drive my ambition.
But I always think humility is for people who should be. do you know what I mean? I think if you're ambitious, you necessarily have a bit of arrogance about you. Like whenever someone says, "Oh, I want to change the world," I go, "Well, that's a really arrogant thing to say." Basically, what you're saying is the other 8 billion people on the planet have got it wrong, but you can fix things. And they go, "Oh, I don't really think of it that way." I go, "Well, I know why, because you need to sleep with yourself at night." However, it is an arrogant thing to say. And I think anyone who wants to drive change or have an impact or do something extraordinary, you actually need some swagger and some BS to you to actually and the celebration of it, the fancy car or whatever it is, the nice holidays, particularly if you've come from a more humble upbringing, those badges of success, the expensive watch or whatever it is, become an important benchmark for, I always say, I like expensive watches.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that, does anyone need a $10,000, $15,000 watch in 2024? And I go, my watch doesn't even tell the time. It tells people I went to school with, Dan has done very well.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that there's an element of that.
Yeah.
And there's also an element of if you've not come from success, or from wealth or from notoriety, there's a little bit of feeling like a pretender, and some of those symbols of success become proof points, not just to other people but to yourself.
There's an enormous fragility to it that's why I wanted to pause here as well, because I know it was interesting in those days and to this day. Kirsten would say, back when we were young, she said, "You think you're better than most people," and I'd say, "I am." And she goes, "Oh, you can't say that!" Like it was outrageous because I was too stupid to keep it to myself. But at the time, I said it out loud, and she's like, "You can't say that." And I was like, "But I work harder. I'm pretty smart. I'm motivated. I'm not goofing off like the people around me. Like I'm really trying as hard as I can to exploit every ounce of talent that I have. And so at some level, doesn't that make me better?" And she's like, "Well, yeah, but you don't say it out loud."
Yeah, of course it does. But if you're a sports person and you said, "I'm the best cricket player in Australia," no one bats an eyelid.
Yeah.
But if you say you're smarter than someone or you work harder than someone, so again, coming back to those metrics for success, like I would say the same thing, right? Like toe-to-toe on IQ, I'm in the top 1%, right? And so, but you're not allowed to brag about IQ, and then, there's a few reasons why we probably shouldn't. But
yes.
You can't, certain things are okay to brag about and certain things aren't. And it's social convention more than anything else.
In my 25 years as a CEO, one of the hardest things to find was a consulting and advisory firm where they'd actually been CEOs. I created CEO Advantage to be the advisory firm I was looking for. Go to ceoadvantage.com.au and find out how we can help you and your team be the best in the business. So the fragility part of that is that perhaps you haven't experienced it, but I had this experience of going, how isolating. When I was young and being successful, I didn't have anything to talk to other people about. I was boring and I was sort of isolated and became very, very fragile and quite cross about that. So people would say, "Oh, you were lucky." And I'd be quite cross about being called lucky, saying, "Do you know how hard I've worked," and all those different things. And fortunately, got to a place where it's like, "Oh, no, what? I'm fortunate rather than lucky. I'm fortunate to have been born where I was born and the gender and all of the things that I've had. So I'm fortunate, but I don't know if I worked hard to be lucky, and people who often are lucky, and luck does play a part in success at different points. But I was surprised at that time how when I was at my most successful, I was at 27, and it took me years to make as much money as I made in that year in 1997.
Yeah.
was the least happy year of my entire life. I got chronic fatigue syndrome because I got sick, and then I kept working and I kept, pushing and doing all those different things. And I got more and more depressed. And I can remember going to the GP and saying, I'm going to jump off Iron Cove Bridge if you can't fix me today. And he was like, can't fix you today, but I'll give you something that'll make you feel a bit better. But it'll take a while. But it was that, even when I said it out loud, it was a momentous sort of thing of going, my goodness, how did I get here? Every other measure in my life is successful and I'm miserable. What on earth? And it was fortunate for me that I had a mentor at the time who really distracted me from, all the ways you're measuring success are wrong. But because you'd come from a working background, all those sort of things, you thought it was this, but it's actually this. And it was the embracing of, oh my goodness, what are these fluffy measures around contributing and thinking and being kind and being present, all those different things. At the time, I was like, what a lot of tosh that was. But when I started doing that, going, man, these things, this is really successful and wealthy. Did you have a moment of being fragile? Have you always had a really good handle on being successful young and not drinking your own Kool-Aid, for example?
No, I still think I drink my own Kool-Aid. I think there's a great line in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof that Big Daddy says, I've spent my whole life like a balled up fist.
Yeah.
And I think that, I think I'm a little bit that way. So I don't really process the world through happy or not.
Mm. I was always comfortable with I always said, I'm happy to be unhappy because being unhappy motivates me to move away from unhappiness.
It's funny. I had this conversation with Kieran, and she's very much, buoyant and optimistic and almost the complete, yang to my yin. And I think that there's and she's always really surprised that I don't process the world through am I happy or not.
Mm.
And there's some interesting studies that, the happiness seems to be or register as a set point for people.
Mm.
When they do surveys, people tend to have a set point for happiness. And Kieran often talks about this. She says, like Kieran's probably a 9 out of 10. He sort of bounces back to happy when something happens. Whereas I would be I'm at the Dexter end of that scale. But I think that there's I actually think there's a kind of resilience when you're not processing the world through the need for happiness, because I think that can be problematic as well. That pursuit of happiness, and certainly the Stoics would argue, similarly that the pursuit of happiness is a fool's errand, and being able to find meaning is probably more useful, or being able to find growth is probably more useful. And I think I probably filtered the world that way. So I don't think I ever felt like any success I had made me vulnerable. I think, if anything, it probably just increased my appetite, and I just looked for other avenues to feed, that desire for success.
Mm. One of the things that you and I share a bit in common is I had a 360-degree survey done on me one time, and the one, it's funny how you get 99 compliments and there's one thing and then you're like, who said that? And the bit that came back to me that really shocked me was that I was intimidating. And I couldn't believe, because it was never my intention to be intimidating. But the people around me said, have you seen what your face looks like if you don't get your way? So they then put me through media skills training, and I saw that face and went, wow, that looks homicidal.
Yeah.
However, my face is angelic compared to when you're not getting your way. I've seen your that ferocious, steely look, and you're a big fella too, so a tall fella. But you've harnessed that, almost embraced it in a way. But how have you wrangled that sort of because you've got this ferocious desire in you, but you've also got this ferocious desire on the outside where it's visible, right?
I'm also loud.
Yeah.
Right. And capable of violence.
Yeah.
And so, but again,
just because you're capable of it doesn't mean you're going to.
No, of course not. No, but it's also a function of, in terms of human evolution, we haven't really changed all that much in the past 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm meant to be on a longboat on the North Sea on my way to invade the British Isles, right? And I look like it.
Yeah.
I read an interesting study actually that the people who have the worst resting bitch face on the planet are the Dutch, the Danish, and the Germans, all of which combine on my face. So, and my sister actually called me up. We've had this conversation before. I was on Sunrise talking about something. I was being interviewed alongside Jane Caro, who's an old friend of mine. We've been friends for decades, and another Gruen alum. And my sister called me up and goes, "Wow, you really hate that Jane Caro." I go, "What are you talking about? We've been friends for years." And she said, "Well, dude, you've got resting bitch face and you've got it bad." Like she said, "Don't be offended. We've both got it, but yours is really bad." And I went and I watched the interview and I went, "Oh, wow." So when I'm thinking, my brow furrows and I look furious and I'm not. I'm just paying attention. I'm deeply interested.
Yeah.
It's just that, that's not how my face communicates. So I've had to learn how to fake a more friendly, thoughtful face and to cultivate that. But also, it's also frustrating. It's like, around small, quiet people who demand that you moderate yourself in order that they don't feel less. And I go, well, hang on, if I've got to make myself less so you don't feel less, that's not me treating you as an equal. I mean, I'm not threatening you, so I'm not actually being aggressive. There's no implied threat. You feel threatened, and I think that's a useful distinction, is some people can feel threatened without you being threatening. And a lot of that has more to do with who they are and how they feel to the world. But I also think it's useful to understand how you're perceived. I think one of the things that when Kieran and I are doing communication training with people, we say that one of the biggest mistakes you make is you think any conversation starts at zero, starts at neutral, and it never does. The moment you've walked in, now I've talked about Kieran a lot. So I'm 6'2", Kieran's maybe 5'3". I'm a man, she's a woman. She can make a joke about me on stage. I can never make a joke about her on stage. And, we've done it in the past. People come up and said, "I thought what you said about your business partner was awful." And I say, "Well, what a shame you don't see her as my equal." And of course, sometimes, I've made a joke at Kieran's expense and Kieran's gone, "Oh my God, that's really fun." I said, no, I can never do that again. Did you not see the audience reaction? So I think, and you can complain and say, well, that's not fair. But that's just the reality of life. Look, there is no fair in life. There is no equal in life. There is no equal in the animal kingdom. There is no equal in the plant kingdom. Trees at the top of the canopy steal sunlight from the ferns at the bottom, and they have to evolve and adapt, right? And I think we have this very childish desire for fairness in the world, and I don't think it exists. I think you've got to find where you can win. What assets have you got that someone else hasn't got? And so Kieran can be more, when Kieran goes into a mining town and we're doing training with these blue-collar workers, Kieran can sass them in a way that I never could, because they're not going to stand up and throw a punch at her, but they will at me.
Yeah.
And so I think it's about understanding that we've all got different gifts and going, okay, well, how does the unique combination of my experience, my education, my passion, and my interest, how does that tie up to something that's really interesting that I can win at and only I can win at?
It's a nice segue to go back in time now, where you leave the agency with Kieran and and go out on your own to do these fabulous things that you do with the Behaviour Report, and before that, the Impossible Institute. work. And tell me about the conversation, the day, if you remember it, the day you had a conversation with Kieran and said, let's go into business ourselves. Or did it just happen and you found yourself? How did you find yourself in business for yourself?
Yeah, it was. So I I talked about that we shared our personal and professional goals with the team. And one of the people who was in her team was a stand-up comedian. And I'd shared I want to do stand-up before I'm 30. And so...
And how old were you then when you said that?
I forget how old I was when I said it. I was in my 20s. But about 3 months before my 30th birthday, he enrolled me in a stand-up comedy course, said, you're on stage in 6 weeks, start writing.
Huh.
And so I did the stand-up comedy course and did really, and again, it's one of those things where I did really well. Success was too fast.
Mm-hmm.
And by the end of the year, I was, I'd sort of moved to the UK via the United States to do stand-up comedy. And I spent 3.5 years doing stand-up comedy, sort of on and off, coming back. And at that time, Kieran and George had said, you've never had a holiday, you're 30, and they bought me around the world air ticket and said, come back, sporadically when you're ready. And so, I did that.
What an incredible gift and opportunity that.
Yeah, it was awesome. It was awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, mind you, I had 10 years of holidays saved up. So, but so I went and I did that, and I was, and part of it was because I was a really terrible presenter. Like I was awful. We once had a client ask Kieran if I was autistic, because I'd come in and I'd sit in the meeting with frowny face, say nothing, and then I'd send a verbatim summary of the meeting the following morning in an email. Mm. And they're like, who brought Rain Man to the meeting? Right.
Do you still do that? Because for our listeners, Dan and I were on a board together, and I would sit across the table from Dan in board meetings, and he would do a very good impression of disinterested as he drew in his book, and then would look up, and he hadn't missed anything. You did a very good act of looking like you weren't listening, right, as you doodled in your book, and then you would look up and you would be able incisively to gather the whole thing. Do you still do that?
Yeah. Well, I draw to occupy the busy part of my brain so I can pay attention.
Ah, interesting.
So, yeah. So, and I still do that and have always done that. Mm. It's interesting. I mean, in my head, I didn't know it came across as disinterest. Mm. But I can see that it would. So yeah, I've always done that and still do that, and still, I actually think, Kieran and I we've spent a lot of time training people in different thinking styles, and I actually think mind maps work for people who are quite linear in their processing. Mm-hmm. And so I mind map. Kieran hates it because Kieran is very non-linear in her processing. And one of the things about mind maps is it allows you to literally draw lines between disconnected things. So that's what I mean by a linear process. And so yeah, I still do that. And I was this terrible presenter, and I figured stand-up comedy was training at altitude. Hmm. So
what does that mean when you say stand-up is training at altitude? What does that mean?
Well, if I have to get up in front of a boardroom and make a business presentation, or if I'm presenting at a conference, no corporate audience is going to yell out, "I shagged your mum." Right? I mean, I'm ready if they do, but the stand-up comedy is so I work as a conference presenter now, and if you get a laugh a minute or a laugh every 2 minutes, you're the funniest presenter they've seen all day.
Yeah.
In stand-up comedy, that's dying.
Yeah.
Stand-up comedy, you need to pull a laugh out of an unwilling audience every 10 to 15 seconds. And so it's very, very lean as an art form. And so that's what I mean. And it was really, you get, and you need to die on stage. You need to get heckled on stage, and you need to learn how to respond to that, not just in terms of how to shut someone down, but how you personally respond to it. How do you recalibrate yourself? How do you not take it personally? How do you not lose your footing? How do you not lose the confidence of the audience? So I actually think it's a really it's funny, you asked earlier, did I have a plan? Sort of, but my life makes much more sense in retrospect than it did going forward. Like if you go, oh, he had a professional career and was a stand-up comedian and now he works as a conference presenter. Yeah, those things make sense in retrospect. But going forward, I'm sure my parents were like, oh my God, what's he doing now? I think it must have looked chaotic for them. And they're it's funny, my parents are both really small, quiet, conservative, humble, unassuming people. And I'm like, the arrogant Dutch milkman's kid or something, right? So I ended up doing stand-up comedy and sort of coming back and working in the agency in between because, when you work in foreign countries doing stand-up, you only get a 3-month visa, so you got to leave the country all the time to come back in. And so, I'd come back, I'd work in the agency and go back and so then I came back and was working in the agency after those 3 or almost 4 years doing stand-up. And someone said to me, oh, do you want to come and speak at a conference? I go, sure, that'd be great. They said, you've got this commercial career, you've been a stand-up comedian. And so I went along to that and I was speaking, and as I was listening to people speaking backstage, they were all talking about how much they were being paid for this speech. I'm like, wait, what? Because I'm much better than any of you and I'm not being paid. And so I ended up meeting a guy named Matt Church, who was the founder of Thought Leaders.
Yep.
And Matt sort of said, and at the time, Kieran and I, we'd sold our agency into another agency. We were doing the earn out. We were deciding, do we start another business? Do we start another advertising agency? Do we start something different? And Matt said, well, maybe don't start a business, maybe start a practice. And a business is when you've got employees who do all the work and the goal is you build a business and then you sell it for some lotto-like figure.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a practice is very low overheads, high cash flow, and the exit is through investment, not through sale. And
investment in other things?
Well, so for instance, Kieran and I try to run our business on a 70% margin, as opposed to most businesses that run on a 10, 15% margin, right?
Yep.
So they underpay themselves. So in other words, you pay yourself a lot in a practice and you invest in property or shares or whatever takes your fancy, right? If you're smart. I don't always do that. I still like nice things. But I think that was so that was a really interesting model. And so I went, well, I'm doing this speaking thing, but there's also training because people don't just want the speech, they want to learn how to be, drive better performance, how to create better teamwork, how to be better communicators and presenters. And so that was what Kieran and I decided to go out and start, was to build a business that was just the two of us with 1 or 2 support staff, having built agencies and run businesses with lots of people, and realizing that's the worst part of business is the people, sort of, and it was, and the other thing is, so we were unusual in the advertising industry, whereas we held clients for, decades. Usually in the advertising world, or certainly at that time, if you had a client for 5 years, that was a good tenure.
Yeah.
We were like 17 years, 20-something years we'd held clients. And which was great, but it was hard work. Whereas training and speaking is like going from, a long-term relationship to nothing but one-night stands. You work on stage, you go to work for an hour, you say goodbye and you're the best thing they've ever had and they never hear from you again. And that there was an appeal in that as well because, Kieran and I had both worked really hard. And there was sort of an enjoyment in that space as well. So it yes, there was a conversation, but it was almost an evolution where there was an overlap between, doing the earn out in the agency that bought us and us starting this other business. And I kind of started it first simply because at that time I'd just started doing the Gruen Transfer as well. So I was on the 2 pilots for Gruen, did the very first episode, did the first 6 seasons. And it was stupidly successful. I don't think any of us predicted it. And all of a sudden, anonymity went out the window. It was on every Qantas flight. It was the only show that was shown. So I was on planes. I couldn't get up and go to the bathroom because I'm on the screen as well.
There was no show like it at the time, was there? Anywhere?
I remember at the time thinking it's a show about my job on the ABC.
Yeah.
Right? It's not going to be that big a deal. And I think we did 1.5 million people on the very first episode. And I had people bailing me up in the street the following morning. And it was, I'd walk into a cafe and every time I'd look away, people would point. And I wasn't prepared for that. I'm not sure any of us were. And so that led to lots of speaking work because people were like, I've seen him on TV and he used to be a comedian and he's got this track record of building successful businesses and brands. So it was kind of this perfect storm of opportunity as well. And so it was quite meteoric. And again,
were you lucky?
Oh, for sure. And again, it also inflated my sense of self-importance and arrogance, which I stand by.
Yeah.
But I think that there's it was a convergence of things. And I actually think so I've just been in Perth for 2 weeks working at the Forest Research Foundation with PhD students and postdoc students, some really, really smart people.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been having one-on-ones with them. And I think one of the things that I'm good at and one of the things that, is relevant to that observation is I think most of us think of ourselves as being straight lines, but we're more like triangles. And by that I mean someone says, oh, I'm an accountant or I'm an engineer or I'm a whatever, right? And that's a straight line. I go, well, what else have you got? What else is, what's the thing that you do that seems completely unrelated? And so what I was doing with these researchers in Perth was saying, tell me, just sitting with them for an hour, just going, tell me about your life. Tell me how you got here. Tell me what the different parts of experience, what your passion is. And there was one guy who was an English literature researcher, like very narrow niche. But he was also into video games and he also worked as a teacher and he liked teaching kids. And I said, okay, well, how might those three things combine into something no one's ever seen before? Mm-hmm. And that's so Kieran and I, run a coaching program called The Unique Advantage. And that's essentially what we do, is we sort of look for those disparate things. And for me, it was the business background, the strategic brain, stand-up comedy, and all of a sudden I'm on this TV show.
Mm-hmm.
And so those things tied up into, this profile and commentary job that didn't exist. Like I didn't know what I do was a thing I could do when I was at school, And so it kind of evolved. And I remember it reminds me of when I was 30, I wrote a book with a friend of mine who enrolled me in the stand-up comedy course. We're in his place in London. His name's Marty Wilson. And he said, what else are you working on? I said, I've got this idea for a book. And he goes, what's it about? I go, it's called If I Knew Then, A Guide to Avoiding Regret. And he said, oh, I like that concept, but I don't like the title. So we changed the title to What I Wish I Knew at 18. And we wrote this book and we were 30. We just interviewed like a couple of hundred people and said, if you could go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be? And probably the wealthiest guy that I interviewed, the most financially successful person I interviewed, there's this guy in the United States. One of the questions I said was, what would you tell yourself about goals? He said, don't set them. They're too limiting.
Too limiting.
He said, I could not have imagined the life I live today, let alone set it as a goal. So have a sense of direction, but almost squint your eyes when you're looking in that direction and be open to what shows up. And I think that's what I've tried to do is be open to what shows up, conscious that I don't know what's possible. I don't know what's around the corner. And technological advances make life less predictable. And if you look at the industries that dominate now compared to the 1980s, they're completely different industries. And even the brands we know are completely different. And so I think that's a useful filter, is being assuming you've got game in a particular area. And oftentimes I'll say to when I'm working with clients, I'll go, what's the value you provide? Not the service you provide or the product that you sell. What's the value you provide? Because the value might be eternal, but the product or the service might change. Kodak was in memory preservation, but they thought they were in film, and that's what cost them.
It's interesting. I do a lot of mentoring these days, and have done for a while, but particularly where with accounting people and having accountants. And I can remember when I first started my business, one of my great terrors was I didn't understand accounting. I just knew how to sell and create value. And at the time I thought, oh God, I'm the dummy. And as my career sort of unfolded, I realised that, that was actually the bit that was valuable. The money just sort of falls out as a product of creating value. And was really became, when I was younger, I thought that was the thing I wanted, but it became less and less and less interesting, except as a scorecard for value of
Sure.
I'm interested though in, you touched on how the world's changed, and I'm interested to sort of step into this. Christopher earlier on an earlier podcast said, we're entering the age of AI, and I'm interested in whether you think that as a statement has truth to it, and then how do you see the role of humans being humans in a world where there's deep fake and there's people talking about we may not be the smartest thing on the planet in the future, and all those different forecasts? What's your take on all this?
Most of us have never been the smartest.
Are we in the age of AI, do you think?
I think we are. I mean, look, and AI, it's at the moment we've got algorithmic intelligence, not artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, I've sat in some very interesting rooms where I'm working with clients that have shared technology with me that most people don't have access to. So it's further advanced than we think.
I saw something this week that just blew my mind.
I know. So look, I think it's an interesting conversation. I was hosting the Telstra Innovation Conference in Melbourne years ago. And it's a big room, 3,000 or 4,000 people. I did the opening keynote, and the client said, "Oh, Dan, we've got Ray Kurzweil, the futurist from Google, coming out. Would you mind staying on stage and interviewing him?" I'm like, God, of course.
Yeah.
So I did this joke at the beginning when I was introducing Ray. I said, so his most famous book at the time was The Singularity is Near. And I said, I love the book, Ray. I'll be honest, I skimmed the book, but I love the movie. Come on, get down on the floor, Ray. And I did the Arnold Schwarzenegger thing. And everyone laughed, and he got up, and Ray basically said, "No, Dan's right. That's pretty much what I'm predicting." And his observation was the biological evolution has reached its limit. The next stage of evolution will be technological, not biological. And like, he's probably slightly more optimistic than me in that he thinks there'll be a convergence between humanity and artificial intelligence. My view is, if it is that smart, why would it even bother with us? Biological life is fragile. Why not just turn the oceans to acid and turn the entire planet into a battery? I mean, so now that's very fatalistic, and I don't have any kids, so I can make statements like that. However, I do think that there's a really interesting study Kieran shared with me the other day. A group of psychologists did a test, and they found that it was a test between AI and 4-year-old children, and the AI smashed the 4-year-old kids in everything apart from generative problem solving, creativity. Right? Now, at some point, and when I say AI is algorithmic intelligence, it's better than we are at sourcing all of the options and creating something with what already exists. What
already
it's
exists.
terrible at doing is making those leaps, those counterintuitive leaps that don't make any sense.
Yep.
And so it's less good at being stupid than human beings are. So that's potentially our future.
Mm.
And I also think, I talked about Kurzweil as a futurist. My favourite futurist was H.G. Wells. And, if I have a look at the time machine and I look at what's playing out in modern society and the polarisation of our communities, we have become the Eloi and the Morlocks.
Absolutely. We're seeing that in the spread between rich and poor and polarisation of the inability to tolerate debate. It's got to have a win or loss rather than
absolutely
reveling in the joy of spirited debate.
Yeah, and again, if you think about that, that world was essentially supported by AI. So he predicted that, right?
And how long ago? That was 100 and
a long time ago,
more than 100
turn
years
of
ago.
Last century. Yeah,
yeah.
But so I think it's an interesting conversation, and I think, so my brother was a country copper, but with a double degree in economics and finance. So super smart, but always wanted to be a cop, which he now tells me was a horrific vocational error. But we were having a conversation about, everyone says, computers are going to replace all our work and we're going to have all this leisure time. And they've been saying that since the 1980s, right?
Yeah.
However, things like AI and robotics potentially replace a lot of things. And the conversation we were having was not what will people do, but rather how do we occupy time? Because if you go to, housing commission estates where people haven't got anything to occupy their time, you actually see a lot of social problems and social discord and people feeling disengaged and not having a sense of meaning. And that's more problematic than, them not having a job is how do people fill their time? So I think we are entering an age of AI. However, I don't think there's any guarantees on what that looks like. I think, yes, jobs will be replaced. Yes, anything that can be duplicated or replicated is going to be taken.
Yep.
And certainly a lot of that crunch work, like even watching people write emails now, even some of those really basic functions will be taken away. Now, does that free us up for higher orders of thought? Potentially. However, we've got a human race that has 65 million years of evolution for blue-collar work. So, we talked about sports people, retiring at 30 with limited intelligence and bodies that were built to commit assault. And it's like, well, we kind of don't need that model of a human being anymore in a world where robots can do a lot of the heavy lifting work. And we'll be doing the heavy, we were working with people in the disability and aged care sector, and the average person in the aged care sector is a woman in her 50s. Now, a woman in her 50s is not going to lift a guy my size in and out of bed. So that will be a robot doing that
Should
work.
be using assistive technologies.
Exactly. So I think it's a mixed blessing. It's nothing is good or bad.
The one thing that I wonder about is, particularly with social media and doom scrolling and all of the, is that we're entering an age of AI with a community that's almost terrified of boredom.
Yes.
The idea of not being able to doom scroll on their phone, or even if they're driving along this beautiful countryside but they're staring at their phone, that you can't stand in a lift anymore and just sort of even stare ahead. You've got to quickly whip out your phone and stare at it even though it's got no signal in the lift shaft.
Yeah.
That if machines can come and take away tasks and processes and all of those different things, and we're afraid of what's left, which is potentially boredom. But tolerance of boredom is where the magic happens. It's where thinking happens and discourse happens and reflection happens and all of those different things. But is it fair, or is it a reasonable observation to see that we do seem to have a community these days who's so afraid of boredom they couldn't possibly imagine doing nothing, that it falls into dysfunction, or are you seeing in your audiences and the people that are engaging you, because your career is about engaging thought and finding humanity, your human, that value that you're adding that's uniquely human. Is that a concoction in my mind, or is that something that's happening that your business and your activity is bringing something to?
I actually think it's both.
Yeah,
right. I don't think it's either or. I think we're on a spectrum.
Yeah.
And certainly, if you have a look at someone like Jonathan Haidt, social psychologist out of the US, he talks about yes, social media is problematic, but the triggering point was when it became a gambling model with the addition of the like button.
Yeah.
People started gambling for likes and faking stuff, and so that becomes problematic.
And however, the echo chamber sort of algorithms.
Algorithms feed our own opinion back to us, which increases polarization and all that kind of stuff. But again, I was talking with a friend of mine, Mark McCrindle, who's a social researcher out of Sydney, and we were making the observation that culture tends to work like a pendulum. Like it swings to progressive, then it swings to conservative, then it swings to progressive, and it swings to conservative. And I think we're sort of in a social media correction at the moment. And I think it's still so new, and most of the platforms are so new that we're still sort of figuring out how this works. And you're even finding, people are deleting platforms, even young people. Look, if I look at Kieran's little girl, my goddaughter, and how her generation interact with social media, it's completely different to the way our generation interacts with social media.
Yes.
And so I think it's evolving, but I also think that there's also an appreciation for, the creator economy, for craft, for like if I have a look at some of the shows that over-index on television and do really well, they're renovation shows or learning how to do, functional stuff with your hands.
Mm.
And I think that's so I actually think it's going to be both. But it won't be a clean or easy journey to whatever that future looks like. It's going to be messy, and it always is. And I also think, every generation thinks the generation that follows it is useless and that the world's going to end in my generation. We're predicting that forever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think part of it is because we become more fearful as the world changes more quickly. And if I think about watching, so my mum and dad, I've been staying with them for a few days a week. Mum was in hospital. Mum's 84, dad's 91. And watching mum try to use a phone is like watching a puppy try to solve a Rubik's Cube. They're just not designed for technology, right? And at some point, I think that appetite for the new and the novel starts to wear off. And I think that happens to all of us.
Yep.
So, but on the upside of that is we're not the generation that has to solve the whole problem. There's, the generation that will solve a large part of that problem is still in school.
Yep.
And I think that's, there has to be a little bit of suspension of disbelief and trust that people will figure it out. So, I think, will AI ever become sentient? It seems so.
Mm.
And maybe it's arrogant to think that human beings are the last stage of evolution.
Mm.
Maybe we're just, one of the very early stages and there's another, 65 million years ahead without us.
Mm.
So, which is not a great thought when you're thinking about yourself and your kids. However, there's, we wouldn't be the first species on this planet to become extinct.
Indeed. True. Let's you touched on a piece of your work where you ask people to think about what you would tell your 16-year-old self. So I want to go there with you. What would 2024 Dan tell Dan at the end of the 80s, early 90s? What would he tell young Dan? What advice would he give him?
That's a really good question. And that's kind of changed over the years. I think it would be there's no such thing as safety. There is no safe road. It's all a risky road, so pick the road you want. And I think the other thing would be to not be more balanced, but certainly to invest in things other than work. I think, I'm very much, I'm a human being that is very much defined by their work and not a lot else. And that's cost me in terms of health. It's cost me in terms of relationships. It's cost me in terms of opportunity. And I think that, that's one of the, and maybe that was a generational thing. Like if I look at new leaders coming up that I work with, they're less willing to compromise everything. And we like to beat them up for that, you soft pieces of, but I actually think that there's a wisdom in it.
Yeah. There is a generational thing that perhaps people of our vintage are at the end of the older way of thinking, but the beginning of the newer way of thinking that is a bit, I must admit, I look at a little bit jealously going, oh my goodness.
Don't you dare be happy and successful.
Yeah.
I didn't have that luxury.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, I found that much later than you're finding it.
Yeah.
It's an interesting patch. What would 18-year-old Dan say to you now? What advice would he give you?
Probably look at me and say, is that it? Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's funny, you look back and you're such a different person.
Yes.
You think, I think at every stage of life, you hit 20, you hit 30, you hit 40, you hit 50, you think, oh, I've finally figured something out. And then 10 years later, you look back and you go, oh, I really didn't have a lot figured out. And I think that's just till the end of life. You keep learning and reflecting and going, that wasn't the best decision. But I think he'd be surprised. Simply because I don't think he would have conceived of all of the the different things that I've done in life. I don't think I ever, I don't think at 18 I ever conceived of the idea that I'd be living overseas for a large part of my life and living in different countries and sort of being interviewed on TV and asked my opinion about things. I don't think that I certainly had opinions, but I don't think it ever occurred to me that was going to happen. Or I certainly didn't think it happened to people like me. It's funny. I remember when I did I went to the family Christmas party after the first year I started doing Gruen, and my cousin, who's very Western suburbs working class, came up to me and he said, "Oh, I was in the kitchen the other night, and I was doing the dishes with the wife, and I had the TV on in the other room, and I hear this voice, and I go, that sounds like my cousin Dan." So I ran into the room, and I go, that is my cousin Dan. He said, people like us aren't meant to be on TV unless we're wanted for something, Dan.
Wow, people like us.
Yeah, and it was yeah. So I don't, so I wonder if at 18 I could have even conceived of that.
Yeah.
Probably not.
Yeah. There is something about the way you talk, though, where it seems like, and we've known each other for quite a while now, where people like us was never a box that you were going to be satisfied with.
Oh, sure. Well, I also didn't think I fit. Like I've always felt like an outsider. It's funny, you talked about feeling isolated. I've always felt isolated.
Yeah.
Like even in a crowded room, I feel really isolated. It's funny, people go, oh, you're a professional speaker, you're on training, you're talking to people all the time, you're so extroverted. Whereas on the extroversion scale, most of my time I'm at the more introverted end.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and live very much in my head. I mean, Ken Robinson said, professors see their bodies as ways of getting their brains to meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've always sort of seen myself a little bit that way as well. And I think that feeling a little bit like an outsider can be frustrating, and maybe everyone feels it to some extent or another. Maybe it's not binary; it's a spectrum, and contextual. But I think that I think that it allows you to. It's useful for things like strategy. It's useful for things like comedy because you get to be an observer.
Mm.
One of the things I noticed was when I was traveling around the world doing stand-up comedy is it's easy to do stand-up comedy in a country you're not a local in because you see the things that they've all become blind to.
Yeah, you don't have store blindness.
Yeah, exactly. And, so my first gig in Europe, I hosted the Amsterdam Comedy Festival. And I wrote probably 10 minutes of material just walking around Amsterdam, just observing stuff, and saying things that, I went to the Anne Frank Museum. I don't know how the Germans missed it. There are signs all over the place, right? And it just seeing things or even when I was in Ireland, the Republic, not Northern Ireland, when you go around a corner, they have a sign painted on the road that says slow. And when you get a little bit further around the corner, it says slower. And I'm like, how cynical are the road guys in Ireland? And it hadn't even occurred to them that seems really cynical because that's all they've ever seen.
Yeah.
So I think that, one of the advantages of feeling slightly outside is you get to see things other people can't, but you also get to see bigger parts of the picture. And I think one of the things that we do really poorly is we do think in a very binary way. We think this happened, that happened, therefore this caused that.
Mm.
And I think that's so rarely the case that something linear happens. It's more like a web. So something happens in one part of the web, it affects something in another part of the web, and then something happens over here that seems completely disconnected from its cause.
Mm.
And actually it's multiple causes.
Mm.
And I think that's one of the things that human beings typically do poorly. Like we're quite a primitive design.
Mm.
We're designed to survive based on limited information.
Mm.
And I think, that's one of the things that AI will potentially make us better at is making better decisions.
Mm. You thrill at the idea of curiosity and learning and observing. And lots of people don't necessarily get the thrill out of, they're not even looking sometimes. They're so busy doing their doing or getting on with things. Whereas you thrill at the idea of doing things but then standing outside and interrogating it and being curious about it and doing those sorts of things. And when you watch this back, and I'm sure you've seen yourself on camera, a lot of the times when you see yourself animate, it's like when you're observing or you're curious about something. And that sense of being an observer and does come from feeling a bit isolated, so almost othering yourself to go, well, I'll stand and I'll be curious about what's going on there. In doing that, are you observing as an outsider and curious, looking for a cue to jump in? Because what you do for a career is on stage and it's visible but it's also contributing to helping people reflect and behave. When you're doing it though, is there a part of you that is looking for an opportunity to jump in, or is it curiosity for the sake of it?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I was thinking about it as you were describing it. I'm not 100% sure. I think it's curiosity for the sake of it. But I'm not 100% sure. One of the things that so Kieran gave a speech once and she said, I just got the best compliment. And I said, what was it? And she said, someone came up to me after the speech and said, I can't unthink what you said. And I think that's part of the thrill is helping people see from points of view they haven't had access to previously. And I think that's the essence of stand-up comedy too. It's like, I'm talking about this, but here's a view you haven't seen before. And it's the surprise and the disconnect that makes for the laugh. So I think that strategy works that way as well. And even so, one of the methods or one of the tools that we use with people is to teach them to think in questions rather than statements. Because usually when you approach a problem, you go, we need to build a bridge. But if you say, how could we get across the river? Well, it could be a bridge, could be a ferry, could be a flying fox, could be a tunnel, could be you get to diverge your thinking before you converge your thinking. And I think that there's one of the other things that we get to do is we get them to think in terms of impossible questions. Because usually our cognitive bandwidth is really narrow. So I'll give you an example. We were working with one of the big four banks. Let's call them Westpac. And they came up to us and they said, we want you and Kieran to come in and run a performance program for our customer service people. Because we get such a volume of calls, there's almost zero chance of you won't be put on hold. People hate being on hold. They get off hold, they yell at our people yell back. It's a downward spiral. So we want you to teach people to get people on and off the phone really quickly, but really good customer service. Really, really quickly, really good customer service. And we said, well, those two things don't really align. And so we said, what if we asked a different question? And we asked an impossible question. What would it take for people to want to be put on hold? And they went, well, that's nuts, right? And we said, okay, but let's play with it. And we talked about gamifying it. You're on hold for 5 minutes, you get a coffee voucher. You're on hold for 10 minutes, you get an iTunes voucher. One of the ideas we came up with was, what if we got a record label to get all of their artists to record unplugged versions of their songs, and the only place you could hear this music was in the banks on hold. People who weren't even customers would ring up and ask to be put on hold. And it actually doesn't matter which of those ideas they execute or don't execute. It's about how do you explore what's impossible and then work backwards to what's possible. And it kind of came out of, it was inspired by two things. It's why we called our parent business the Impossible Institute, because that was our method, right? And it was inspired by two things. The first was high school maths, where we go up until about year 7 or year 8, we go, you can't square root a negative number. And then if you're a smart kid, we go, no, we're going to play let's pretend. And the square root of -1 equals I or J if you're doing electrical engineering. And a whole branch of mathematics becomes possible by accepting an impossible. And the other one was a Douglas Adams book, Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. And it was this idea of a sofa that's stuck on the landing on the stairway, and there's no way to get it up the rest of the stairway, and there's no way to get it back down the stairway. And the only possible explanation is if a portal opened up in space that they could back into as they moved around, right? So that's the thing. But it was this idea of, well, what if we accept the impossible long enough just to explore what's on the other side? And so I think that, that kind of fuels the curiosity, because I think a lot of our limits are A, self-imposed, B, limiting in terms of, they're not even realistic. They're based on parameters that we don't even truly understand. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's the opportunity for what we do in a world of AI, is we're going to have to retrain virtually everyone. Our entire curriculum is going to shift from, an emphasis on critical thinking, which is terrific, to an emphasis on more creative and expansive thinking. So I think that and certainly if you want to survive in the commercial world, that's going to be the critical capacity, and it's one of the things that we devalue. And again, it comes back to where we started. What did you do at school? Did you know what you wanted to do? And that kind of, we petition people into the science people and the art people. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's an artificial petition. We're not either or. We're actually all of those things. It's just that we've underdeveloped one part and overdeveloped another part. Mm. And I think that's kind of the opportunity in the work that Kieran and I do is I talked about tying up disparate threads. I think, we petition ourselves off and go, I'm this at work, or I'm this at home, I'm this kind of thinker or that kind of thinker. And I think the opportunity is to develop every part of ourselves. and actually be a more fully functional human being. And that's actually a really cool thing. And if anything gives me optimism, it's the fact that we're not binary, that we're all on a spectrum, which means that we can move around the spectrum as well.
Mm. That is the opportunity in the age of AI, is that humans are infinitely malleable to, we can just invent because we said so.
Mm.
Why is it so? Oh, I decided. That's not logical. Yeah, but I can.
Yeah.
AI doesn't, well, not yet. It doesn't just randomly decide things for no reason other than I decided it. It popped into my head and I decided. One of the great joys in the work that I've found myself doing now, that, you know, I've taken the pressure off being a professional CEO for 25 years and now working with them, is something that I had as a young person, was this creative idea that work didn't really encourage, but I used throughout my career. But the observation around watching, are you listening to what people are saying? So I'm working with a very sophisticated operation at the moment with lots of power dynamics and all of that sort of thing. And there's lots of talk about it. And the word that I noticed was getting used a lot is it's complex.
Mm.
And I said, it just, as I heard all these people keep saying it's complex, I said, you know, it's not though. It's really simple. Your job is to get from this side of the road to that side of the road. That's not complex at all. What's interesting is how much conversation is going on with the people on this side of the road saying to the people on the other side of the road, have they not noticed the traffic? It's very noisy. It's very fast. In fact, it's really dangerous and inconsiderate of them to even ask us to cross the road. And so, you know, while all this conversation's going on, there's a little guy over here saying, hey, have you thought of a bridge?
Mm.
You're not listening to them because you're so caught up in how outrageous it is that you're being asked to cross. It's not complex. Cross the road. You're not looking for opportunities to cross the road. You're not listening for it. But what does happen, and a very South Australian thing we do here, which is very South Australian, is, we can't afford a bridge. We've got no money for bridges, let alone tunnels. You go, what about a pedestrian crossing? Well, we've got no money for traffic lights and all of that. What about the guy who's got a can of white paint? Yeah. Because you said we've got no money, forever will it be, because you wouldn't even talk to the guy with white paint. With a roller and white paint, could just do a zebra crossing, which would make crossing the road safer. But there's all this noise and outrage. And it was really interesting with this group of people where I said, can we spend an hour without the word complex and go back to going, what are we trying to do? If it's to cross the road.
Yeah.
But the age of AI and it feels like every conversation's got to go out of control and look at how considerate or make value judgments and label things.
Are vested in the complication because there's money to be made in the complication, right?
Yeah, and power dynamics sit in
of course,
in the complication.
But even most problems are usually problems of perception. Mm. So Kieran and I were here speaking at the Australian Dental Industry Association, their symposium here in Adelaide. And, you know, some of the questions we were getting asked, you know, we talked to them a little bit about impossible questions. And one of the examples, we were working with a council in Queensland, and they said, how could you make people like paying rates? There's an impossible question for you, Dan and Kieran. And we go, okay, great. Well, let's stop calling them rates. Let's call it community membership. And then what we're going to do is we're going to geotag all of the work that you've done within a 5-kilometre drive of where they live, and then we're going to show what that cost and what their contribution to that was. So they see how much money was done in their local area, disproportionately more than they're paying. because we like membership, we want nice parks, we want good roads. So you're showing them, here's what we spent on you, you ungrateful prick, and here's what you contributed to your membership. And they went, oh. I'd go, it's just a perception shift. It's a reframing. And we one of the things that the dentist asked us was, how do we make people more patient when they're waiting? And Kieran told the story. So Houston Airport had people were disproportionately frustrated by how long it took their bags to get to the carousel, right? Disproportionately. And so they went and did a study, and the usual thing you do is, blame the baggage handlers, those lazy people.
Yeah.
And so they went and did a study, and they go, well, actually, we're on average in terms of getting the bag. What they realised was the carousel at Houston Airport was closer to the gates that you deplaned from. So they just moved the carousel further away. It wasn't. It was waiting at the carousel that was frustrating people, not the time. So they just changed the physical experience, right? And so again, but you only get there by being willing to ask unusual questions, and I think that's even one of the things that keeps Kieran and I busy is we spend most of our time helping smart people to be people smart, because most smart people are not very good with people. And that's at every level of management. And it's probably, one of the, this is a CEO podcast. It's one of the biggest problems CEOs have, because usually they're technically brilliant. That's how they got the gig. And all of a sudden they've got to be people, and no one trained them for that.
Yeah. So
one of these dentists said, what would you do if you've got someone who said, so I've said to this person that they grind their teeth, and they'll go, no, I don't grind my teeth. I'm really relaxed and laid back. And you go, no, you're grinding your teeth. How would you deal with that? And I said, well, we said a couple of things. I said, the first thing is you've delivered that as a declarative judgment. What you could say is, wow, your teeth are really worn and really, really ground down. What do you think might be causing that? Invite them into the solution. Oh, I don't know. I'm actually pretty laid back, really. Or you might say, and then we said, well, the other thing is you're challenging someone's identity congruence, where if they see themselves as a really chilled, laid-back person, you've told them they grind their teeth. You haven't just told them they've ground their teeth. You've told them you're not who you think you are, which is really confronting. What you could say, and you find some data to back it up, is actually people who are really chilled during the day often grind it out at night. Oh. But again, it's about shifting the perspective from communication as transmission of information, which I think is a really limited view. And it just when I was at university, I was studying communication psychology, and there was it's funny, I can't remember her name, but she was a mature age single mother student, and we were doing models of communication, and it was like transmission, interference, reception, reply, interference, perception, right? Really complicated models. She made a model of communication on a piece of cardboard using the stuff that her kids had. So she had paddle pop sticks for a fence. She had cotton wool balls stuck on a sheep. And in the gateway, she had meaning. And it was multiple sheep moving through a gateway called meaning. And it's always stuck in my head as one of the best models of communication I've ever heard. Because if you think about it that way, it's because we're so used to communicating in our own style, using our own palette of language and our own particular way of speaking and sense of humour, and assuming, well, the other person's just going to get it. And that's not necessarily the case at all. And I think if you shift from transmission of information to how do we create a shared sense of meaning as a goal for communication, that's really important. So I think that and again, that's one of the things that keeps Kieran and I busy. I'm not complaining. It pays the rent. As long as smart people aren't particularly good with people, I'm happy.
Yeah.
But I think it is one of the opportunities, and certainly one of the things that seems to elevate a leader from someone who's a technically good leader to someone who's really good at moving people, is being able to speak from one group of people and shift from one palette to another palette of language, and to translate from one area of language to another area of language, to speak to accountants in the language they need to hear, to speak to frontline workers in the language they need to hear. I think that's a really useful tool, and a lot of it has to do with perception.
And it's one of the great gifts you have, is being able to create perspective for people and get them to stand in a, to realise one of the great advances in elevator technology was the mirror. People's perception of elevator speed was much more affected by a mirror than a motor.
Yeah, exactly.
And as soon as it's pointed out, people are like, oh my goodness, that says a lot about me and the mindset that I was in. And,
it's so funny you say that. I was at the Adelaide Oval Hotel last night, and I got into the lift and there was no mirror. And in my head, I literally went, well, this is going to be a long trip.
Yeah. Isn't it amazing?
It was only 2 floors,
yeah.
but it is one of those things. You're so used to looking at yourself, and we are the most fascinating thing in our world.
Yeah.
And it changes the perspective of time.
Yeah. Dan, this has been fantastic. And as usual, we can talk for hours and hours about this sort of stuff. I've got one more question for you. And in this podcast, it seems to be the question that stumps everybody. And that is, you don't normally drive along in a car. Yours is on your motorcycle.
Mm-hmm.
So you're already smiling, I presume, on your motorcycle. But a song comes on, you've got your earpods in and you're blasting along, and a song comes on that no matter what mood you're in, if you're in a bad mood, it'll make you smile. What is it? What's that song that comes on and makes you smile?
I think that's a really interesting question. I have really obscure musical taste, and actually wanted to pursue a musical career as a young guy. So the 2 genres I listen to are Neue Deutsche Harte, which is the new German hardness, which is German industrial heavy metal, and Scandinavian power metal.
Wow.
And I also grew up in the 1970s watching ABBA on TV. So it's a combination of all of those genres. And there's a young Swedish heavy metal singer called Tommy Johansson, and he does covers of ABBA songs in Scandinavian power metal. So for me, the thing that makes me smile is hearing, those songs that Benny and Bjorn wrote that were just unbelievably well crafted, but delivered in my own genre.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, it's hearing, those fantastic songs from my youth, but just delivered in an amazing way.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you, Dan. And even finishing off the podcast with a different perspective on things has just been fantastic. Thank you so much for being here today. It's fantastic.
Pleasure, Paul.